So the Cappadocians said that formulation, right? Around the time of Nicaea, St. Gregory of Nazianzus was a guy who presided at the Council of Nicaea, or St. Gregory of Nyssa. And so their formulation of the Trinity, that being that the source of the divinity is the Father, and that flows into the Son and the Spirit, that was it. Right, there wasn't another formulation of the Trinity. In fact, it was so important that you had to be in communion with St. Gregory of Nyssa in order to be considered part of the church. It was assumed that if you weren't in communion with Gregory of Nyssa, you had the wrong formulation of the Trinity and therefore were a heretic. So there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room on this. And so St. Basil lays the principle out of how we still worship one God, right? Because people from the very beginning of the church were like, you guys worship three gods. Obviously, you talk about these three people. St. Basil, based off of this formulation of the Trinity, gives the explanation or the premise that the honor, I'll just quote him because I have it here, the sovereignty and authority over us is one, and so the doxology ascribed by us is not plural but one, because the honor paid to the image passes on to the prototype. Who is the image?
Christ.
Thanks, Dylan. Christ is the image, right? So all the honor and worship that we give to Christ is passed on to the Father, who is the source of all divinity. It's the same thing with the Holy Spirit. We give them honor and worship, but it's passed on to the Father, who is the source. And in that way, we still worship one God, which is the explanation St. Basil gives to the critics of Christianity at the time, as why we're still monotheists, even though that wasn't the word they used at the time. And so, if that is where this premise comes from, right, that also relates to the veneration of icons, because we also venerate the image, right? But we're not paying respect to wood.
Are you talking about modalism? Sorry, I missed your thesis, your intro.
So the whole thing is on the theology surrounding the Holy Trinity and the theology surrounding icons, and then how that the principle that underlines both of those is the basis for Christian morality. And so, not quite modalism. You can tie it into modalism because they get the Trinity wrong. But if I venerate an icon, I'm not paying honor and respect to this piece of wood, right? Just in the same way, if I have a picture of my wife and I kiss it, is the honor being paid to my phone? No, I'm giving this honor and affection to my wife. And so the principle, right? If I venerate an icon of Christ, that honor is being passed on to him. And so that's our justification for the veneration of icons. And that's what the Seventh Ecumenical Council gives us the reason for it. Because if you're not familiar with the Seventh Ecumenical Council, for 100 years there was a controversy over icons. The emperor at the time, whose name escapes me, under the influence of some people, decided to outlaw them. He got bishops that were loyal to him, had this synod, and made a decree that icons are to not be venerated anymore. And they were losing to Muslim invaders at the time, trying to push westward. And if you know anything about Islam, they're very iconoclastic. They reject images, and in some cases they reject pictures, whatever depicts a person's face. And he's like, they're winning. What are we doing wrong? We're venerating icons. That's why we're losing the war.
By the way, children are not allowed to play with dolls after a certain age in Islam as well.
Is it because they bear faces?
It's related to images.
Yeah.
Mormonism is like the Islam of the West.
Mormonism is like the Islam of the West, not because of iconoclasm.
They can't even. They're not even allowed to make movies about their religion because they think if a historical movie about a certain person, they think that's an image in itself. As well.
I can think of one movie that was made in the 60s, and I don't know its name, but I see reels of it that come up sometimes.
About being Muslim.
about, I think it's the Muslims entering Ethiopia and turning, it was like part of the Islamification of Africa. I think the movie was about that, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so that controversy surrounding the Seventh Ecumenical Council was 100 years of persecution. People would hide the icons in their homes. And it's not because they weren't in churches. In some cases, they would put them really high up so people couldn't get to them. Right? They just wanted the veneration to stop. They weren't as extreme as, just going all John Knox, like in Scotland, and just breaking everything that had an image or a relic. And so, I thought I had the quote from the Seventh Ecumenical Council, but either way, they quote St. Basil's premise explicitly as the reason why we can do this. They also give lots of others examples.